So good morning, Tommy.
Morning.
Thank you for joining us again for a Hey Legal exclusive, which we're just looking at recent developments in the law or just interesting things that we as lawyers may talk about in our gown rooms. So one topic that you and I have had a bit of a chat about, certainly in recent months, is in relation to prohibitions on this, private prayer. If you're found outside an abortion facility, standing in the street silently praying, then you are open to being arrested for that.
Yeah, I mean, I was drawn into not in relation to people who were standing in the street, which is a reasonable point, but people who are actually standing in their own house.
Yeah.
Because you remember somebody who understandably is seen as a bit of a divisive character, but the USA Vice President, J.D. Vance, did a speech shortly after Trump's re-election, and he claimed that the Scottish government had sent letters to individuals warning them that they could be prosecuted for praying in their own houses. It was such an incredible proposition that I had doubted myself whether there was any truth in it, and I thought, this guy has gone completely mad. And I was kind of thinking of looking into it, and then there was a hysterical reaction by a number of politicians, mainly SNP politicians, who called him out and said that this was complete nonsense. And I thought it's unlikely he would have said it without any basis, although I suppose it was possible. And therefore my initial interest was really just to get to the truth of the situation. I also thought it unlikely, and this was where I was a bit surprised, I thought it unlikely that actual government politicians would deny that they'd done something which they had done. So I thought when they came out swinging for J.D. Vance that the truth of the matter probably lay somewhere in between the 2 points. But actually it turned out he was right. And when I started to dig into it, I found that indeed when the appropriate legislation came in, that in September and October of 2024, the Scottish government did write to people whose houses lay close to safe access zones, which are really any facility that provides abortion facilities, to give it a very wide description. And the letter said that anyone who was found to have breached the law on safe access zones could be fined up to £10,000 under summary procedure, or up to an unlimited amount under solemn procedure. Now, if you're just a non-lawyer or ordinary member of the public who stays next to a hospital and you get a letter from the government saying you might be fined £10,000 if you're not careful, then obviously that's going to get your attention. And the letter went on to summarise the conduct that could give rise to an offence, and said intentionally or recklessly doing something that would influence someone's decision to access the provision of abortion services and or cause alarm or distress to another person relating to their decision to access the provision of abortion services. And went on to say where the conduct could take place, and it said activities in a private place such as a house could be an offence if they can be seen or heard within the zone and are done intentionally or recklessly. So again, imagine the non-lawyer who gets the letter thinking, this is worse than I thought. Actually, I could be fined £10,000 for something I do in my own house. So you read on, and the letter provided a hyperlink to give further information. And if you were worried about the possibility of getting a £10,000 fine, you might click on that hyperlink and you would have been taken to a web page which gave examples of activities within a house that might breach the legislation. And it said, examples of such behaviour where there is intent or recklessness may include silent vigils. Now, I don't know that there's any other way of reading that correspondence and the hyperlink information other than to say, if you're standing at your window conducting a silent vigil and somebody sees you doing it, you're liable for a fine of up to £10,000. So you remember that what kicked my investigation off in the first place was J.D. Vance saying that the government had warned people that if they were praying in their own house, they could get fined. I'm not certain really that there's any difference between what he said and what the government warned them about. I mean, there might be a difference between a silent vigil and private praying. I can't see it. And, you know, as I'm no expert, but if a lawyer is unable to look at the legislation and not draw any distinction between praying and a silent vigil, I'm not sure how a non-lawyer who gets the letter through the door from the government is able to do it. I mean, I think the only way to read it is, you know, if you do anything within your house, even standing silently at your window, you know, that could be interpreted, you know, as a criminal offence.
Yeah.
And it's quite a shocking letter for the government to have to send, I think, where they're saying normally you would expect that criminal conduct takes place out in the street, or, you know, the idea that you could just be standing at your window and because you happen to be within the safe access zone or close to the safe access zone, you could be prosecuted for that. It's scary, I think, isn't it? It's kind of 1984.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the whole buffer zone legislation was, you know, certainly the narrative around it was very much, oh, we need to protect these women, but no mention at that time as to what the implications were for people living nearby. And this kind of overreach by the government, and then the audacity to give false information when challenged about it is of huge concern.
I mean, I've got the response here. Scottish Green MSP Gillian Mackay was prepared to go so far as to allege that Mr. Vance had been happy to lie about it. That's what she said. And she wrote to the US ambassador for the UK, calling for a correction of the record, saying the letter that VP Vance referenced does not mention private prayer and does not suggest that it would be criminalised. Well, it did suggest that offences could be committed within your own home, and the hyperlink took you to a web page that said that silent vigils were an example of potential criminal conduct. So where's the lie?
It seems either she has provided a false response, or she doesn't know her own legislation, and it was her that was pushing for this all along. So that's a huge concern, that she would want to promote such an overreach when she doesn't know about it or is prepared to lie about it.
And they doubled down on, as the Americans say. The Scottish government put out a statement saying private prayer at home is not prohibited within safe access zones, and no letter has ever suggested it was. I've just read the letter. So the combination of the letter and the information accessed by the hyperlink definitely suggests that a silent vigil within your own home could be criminal.
Yeah. And it's quite on the world scene, because I think this was all being played out in front of the world. And you know, I think I was like you hear it and you hear Scotland being mentioned, but yet, you know, it's in front of a huge audience, and yet this member of the Scottish Parliament is prepared to go out and make such
and he was,
statement.
You know, I know we're interested in talking about other freedom of speech issues beyond this, but it was in the context of a speech where he was talking about a variety of measures which were being taken in European nations, which he referred to as punishing thought crime, you know, and this issue was of interest to me for a couple of days. But there is a kind of wider concern that there are more restrictions on what people can say, and as the lines are blurred, if people are not certain what they can say without being punished, the likelihood is they'll just say nothing.
Yeah. And I mean, is your feeling that is the intention behind it all?
Certainly they don't seem to respond well to criticism. You know, I've given an example of that, and the approach was not initially to give a reasoned explanation of what the law actually was. It was to accuse him of telling lies about Scotland, and it became a bit emotive. You know, I suppose the distraction was, how dare he attack Scotland and we're the defenders of Scotland, you know. So I think there is a genuine concern, and this had come up a year earlier in the talk when the hate crime legislation came in. Huge degree of public misunderstanding about what was doing. You know, I did a few media things at the time, and really repeatedly was just pouring cold water and some crazy suggestions about, you know, 1,000 people are going to be arrested a day and 50,000 will be arrested at every Old Firm match and all this. And I was saying, look, it's not really such a big change as everybody thinks. Most of it was already in law. It's been extended a bit. The point was the public were concerned about it. You know, they were concerned about it. And undoubtedly, when the public become concerned, there are just issues that they don't want to touch. You know, they look at social media, they see huge debate on the trans rights issue, for example, and they say, I don't really understand it, so I'm not going to say anything about it because I don't really know what the hate crime legislation is, so I'm not prepared to run the risk of saying something that's going to get me a chap in the door, you know. And so the debate is really left to crazy people on both sides, you know, that people who have got really entrenched views, one side or the other, are just having a barney about it every day of the week. And people who have got a more reasonable approach to it stay out of the debate because they just think it's too hot, you know.
But is that not dangerous in itself? That, I mean, freedom of speech is it's what people fought and died for, really. And yet we are in society now, as you say, people are thinking twice about saying anything. I mean, I've heard you speaking before in podcasts, Tommy, about maybe not so much yourself, but your family seeing things and the vitriol that comes at you for saying certain things, or, you know, taking that to an extreme. Maybe it's not just abuse you get deplatformed. You know, you see people who have been, you know, holding important professional positions who are deplatformed because they're not with the narrative. So this issue of freedom of speech, I mean, do you see it as being eroded in this country?
Undoubtedly, and it's a common tactic if people don't like. I mean, I think I'm reasoned in the things I say on social media, and generally I stick to criminal justice issues. But undoubtedly, it's a tactic to go for the person. You know, we don't. Maybe it's not even that they don't like the argument or they don't agree with the argument. It's more a case of he's saying something that we don't like, you know. And I mean, I don't get an awful lot of it. I don't want to overplay it. It's unpleasant when it happens. It tends to be when I've been critical of something that the government has done. Now, in most countries, having I don't say that I'm an expert, but I know something about criminal justice, so I tend to stick to criminal justice. In most countries, it would be seen as a positive that somebody with 40 years in the legal profession who knows a bit about it is prepared to take on the government. You know, it's good to have citizens who... Now, I don't know if it's unique to Scotland, but every time I do it, you know, there are various Twitter accounts who have a go at me, and, you know, I was named in a list of BBC experts, and the point was they were all pro-union in the referendum. So in other words, don't listen to anything he's got to say. You know, he comes on to talk about legal issues. He's critical of the government. He does it because he's not an SNP supporter. Now, I'm not an SNP supporter, but I've complimented them for things that they've done. I've had a go at people who have criticised them, regularly had a go at the Scottish Conservatives for crazy things that they've put in social media that don't make any sense, where they're saying people are not getting long enough in jail, and this is the SNP's fault, when we all know the SNP don't have any influence on what judges do. You know, they keep trying to blame them for the Sentencing Council guidelines again, which are really nothing to do with the politicians. So I try and be reasonable about it, but, you know, every time, I know if I've been on BBC Scotland and I've said, well, the government should have seen the prison crisis coming 10 years ago, and they've got themselves in a situation, but actually they don't have any option now but to let out 500 prisoners, because I know by the time I've get back to the car, somebody will be on saying this guy's just a unionist, he hates the SNP every time. You know, that's not why I'm going on. Mm-hmm. I'm asked a question and I give an honest answer about it. So my concern is not me, because it's very seldom horrible. My concern is people who are more clever than me and more informed than me will just look at that and say, I don't need it. You know, so that has a direct impact on freedom of speech, doesn't it? If people just say, he gets stick, you know, he gets stick on social media, his kids will see it and they might get upset by it, so why would I do it? I'll stay out it. Yeah. And again, you don't get the benefit of some informed opinions on the subject. And that's my worry about it.
And I guess, you know, it now is very much on social media that these debates, or if you want to call them debates, or just abuse are happening. It's rare now to have, and I guess there's a growing trend of podcasts and having people sit down like this, but you have to have two people who'll have a discussion. Not that we are debating anything today, but we're kind of agreeing on things. But perhaps it is the social media platform that encourages these people, the keyboard warriors who'll just batter out whatever they think. And, you know, it can cause huge upset to people that way. But
I mean, I think in general it's a good thing. I mean, I always had an interest in trying to explain legal issues to people who weren't lawyers. But the reality is, 10 years ago, I might write something about a current legal issue, and it might take me 2 weeks to write it, and then I would send it to the Scots Law Times and they would take 2 months to publish it. So by the time it ever came out, nobody was interested in it any longer.
Or the law had moved on or something,
Whereas, it's, you know, I think it's good that you can get up in the morning and hear something on the radio and say, well, that isn't quite right, you know, actually the law changed 2 years ago or something. I like all that, and I think this is good. And probably the good outweighs the bad on it. I think it does probably encourage people to come and have a kind of personal go at you a bit. But that's definitely a price worth paying from my perspective. It's very seldom horrible. Generally speaking, when people have a go at me, I'm able to kind of talk them round. And, you know, often conversations which start very hostile end with somebody saying, well, all right, now you've explained it, I see your point, you know. I like that. But my worry is that because people are just worried generally about saying something that might get them into trouble, you know. Let me give you an example. I'll keep it anonymous because I haven't asked them whether I'm allowed to share it, but somebody who has been a politician was approached by concerned women whose daughters had been harassed in the city centre, and he had referred to the fact that he believed that people who were in the country seeking asylum who committed sexual offences should be deported. Now, actually, that's more or less the law. You know, the minute you get a sentence, I think a sentence of 12 months or more, which, you know, most people in the High Court get, the legislation suggests that you would be deported at the end of your sentence. And he said this because concerns had been raised, and obviously there was an expectation that he would say something. And he was on the bus going somewhere, and his partner phoned in tears saying it had just been on the news, saying that the police were investigating him. So he got taken in for questioning, and one of the other politicians, or a group of other politicians, had read it and seen his comment, where essentially he was repeating the legislative policy in the United Kingdom, you know, that people who are convicted of serious sexual offences are deported or should be according to the legislation. And for that, he was questioned by the police. Now, I helped him a wee bit and ultimately it came to nothing. But it doesn't matter that it came to nothing. It's good that it came to nothing. But any other politician who hears that story is going to say, I cannot discuss that. If we girls have been harassed in the city centre by people who turn out to be, people who have applied for asylum, I'm just not going to say anything about it, because if I say anything about it, I might get taken into the police station for questioning. So we don't talk about it any longer. And it's a public protection issue at the end of the day. He was able to show that the amount of sexual assaults in the city centre had risen substantially. It's fact based. It's no rhetoric designed to stir up the population. And I know some people are guilty of that. He's saying, well, I'm hearing anecdotally that this is happening, and the statistics to some extent support it, because there's more of this now than there was. But the minute somebody asked me what should we do about it, and I said what I thought we should do about it, I get reported to the police. Now that's no healthy.
No,
it can't be healthy that. And he's not a podcaster or a shock jock. He's a politician. Where they're saying it's your job to make Glasgow safer. You were elected to do various things, and one of the things you were elected to do was make the city centre safer, and we're seeing this as an issue. We're not making it up. We're saying that this is happening. What are you going to do about it? And when he gives his response, he ends up in a police station getting questioned. So I understand whatever view you take of the topic. It's got to be right that people are allowed to have a conversation about it, and the other side can say, well, hang on a minute, actually it's nothing to do with asylum seekers. If you look at the facts, it shows that there are a majority of, there are more sex offences, but more of them are being committed by people who were born in the UK. That you have the debate about it. That the problem is, if you criminalise the debate, then again the debate is occupied by extremists, one side or the other, and you don't get the sensible discussion in the middle that everybody's looking for.
Yeah, but I mean that is pretty powerful. And that does seem to be the current fear factor, isn't it? That normal right-thinking people are now hesitating before either posting or saying things through fear, and examples like that we read about, the powerful effect of that.
And there's another example I can see even less about, because I don't know whether the case is going to be prosecuted, but it's a podcaster who responded to something that was said by a politician, and actually was charged by the police and has been given a undertaking, and it will be a summary case, but I'm choosing not to say anything about it at the moment, because it's yet possible that the Crown might read it and take the view that actually there's nothing criminal in it. But I mean, if you watched it, I don't think many lawyers would watch that and think he's getting close to the stage where he's going to get charged with something. You might not agree with it. It was a bit of a kind of hit piece on the woman who had made some statements. So I'm not really in favour of that, where, you spend 10 minutes basically talking about an individual, but that doesn't make it criminal, And again, if you don't think that some of the issues have been covered by the mainstream media, as they're always referred to, it's good to have people who are talking about the issues. And the worry there is he might just walk away from it and say, well, I found this interesting, and at times maybe I shone a light on things that were been missed, but I'm just going to unplug everything and go and work in Aldi, because it's too risky. I'm now been prosecuted, and I don't think he would get the jail for it or anything, but he could easily he's got to the age of nearly must be in his 50s anyway, without any convictions. No, all of a sudden you've got a conviction for a racially aggravated breach, or worse, for stirring up racial hatred or something.
But then they're for the freedom of speech is curtailed by that.
Yep.
Just even if there's no conviction, even if it's just the threat of conviction, then it, as you say, maybe makes somebody like him think twice and think it's just not worth it. So therefore, freedom of speech has been curtailed even without a prosecution.
Yeah, it's pretty unhealthy. I mean, going back to the hate crime, I saw a lot of talk about it, which was incredibly inaccurate, and a lot of it came from England. Some of the kind of shock news channels were saying, this is the end of the world, and this time next year 50% of Scottish people are going to be in prison because of this hate. I mean, it was mad stuff. And so I was quite outspoken on it, and they would contact me, and I think it was GB News, and I did an interview with Jacob Rees-Mogg, and I was basically saying, you're all going way over the top. The effect of this is not what you're saying. Let's all calm down.
Is that because I think I remember listening to it? It was in law anyway, and I think the fear was it was going to change things significantly. But your point was, well, actually, if you look at the law, there's very little that's going to be changed. And he was reasonable, and I was explaining to him, I think people are taking this a bit out of context. I don't really think everybody's going to be charged. Probably nobody will be charged, because pretty much everything that contravenes these news sections are already offences, and they're much easier to prove. So probably people will be charged with breach of the peace rather than the very complicated offence which the Scottish Government has created. One person contacted me and said, that was really interesting. You did a great job of pouring kind of cold water on this, madness that these people are spouting. I don't know, many people contacted me. How could you appear on that channel? How could you speak to that right-wing nutter and all this kind of stuff? I'm saying I was on trying to calm the conversation down, But, again, a lot of people would get that phone call and just say, I'm not speaking to Jacob Rees-Mogg about anything, because, I'm immediately going to be attacked from one side or the other.
As some kind of right-wing sympathiser. If you listen to the conversation, I'm saying all the stuff is you guys on this channel are talking this nonsense, So,
and how's that played out, Tommy? How has the law impacted convictions?
Well, the only person I've heard been charged under the new law is the podcaster, to be honest. I think on day one there were like 10,000 phone calls to Police Scotland, most of which were complaining about Humza Yusuf and his white speech, and obviously exactly what I said would happen happened. It was weaponised, It's the kind of legislation which is weaponised. People don't like him. A lot of people didn't like him and saw that as a stick to beat him with, and with the double attraction of it being his legislation, essentially, So a lot of people clearly thought it highly amusing to have him charged under his own legislation. Of course, he wasn't charged, and I wouldn't want him to be charged. But that was the kind of thing that, people were just phoning up. But, there was also a sinister aspect which emerged from it, because Murdo Fraser, the Scottish Conservative MSP, discovered by accident that he was on a non-crime hate log. I don't know if you remember that. Round about after the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, it was recommended that the police should keep a record of non-crime hate incidents. And I'm no expert on it, but my understanding was there was a recognition that some terrible or some bad stuff probably falls short of criminal conduct, but the police in each area should still have an idea that it's happening. If there's a lot of bad stuff being said about the Asian population in Rotherham or something, the Rotherham police should know about it, because it might get progressively worse and then you can act on it. I never knew that there was a record in Scotland, and he had it was a trans rights thing on Twitter, and some person had put something about women's rights, and he had liked it or commented on it or something. I think he'd said, "Oh, as from tomorrow, I'm going to identify as a cat," or something like that. Some kind of glib, semi-humorous comment, and he found out that the police had put him on the non-crime hate register for saying it. And it kind of came out by accident because the woman who had put the original thing on had made a freedom of information request or something, and some way along the line it had come out that not only had she been put on it, but because he had liked it or commented on it or something, he'd been put on it. And that was more sinister still, because I thought, maybe I'm on it, for all I know. I mean, who knows that the police are... And I don't think the intention was ever to personalise it. So I don't think the Stephen Lawrence recommendation was ever to say, right, keep an eye on Murdo Fraser. It was more the idea that if a particular hate group is being targeted generally, then if the police had this kind of register, they might see it coming in a way, that there seems to be hostility towards Sikhs in Sheffield or something, so we better keep an eye on that issue. I don't think it was ever a kind of quasi-criminal records idea that, you would have a file, again, it's like, it's kind of East Germany, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's
well, I mean,
Stasi,
it's the secrecy factor as well, isn't it? Like, if it's not going to be used for something, then why have it, and why be secret about it? Why not tell people? And
when I looked into it, and I didn't spend a lot of time on it, but actually in England, somebody had brought a judicial review, and the judges had looked at it, and it was, I think it was the Supreme Court, and what they said was, we can see the reason for it, but it needs to be tighter, there needs to be better freedoms for people to talk about things. And so you need to go and have a look at it and come back with a better scheme. That, I'm paraphrasing wildly, but that was basically what they said. Scottish Police just ignored it. They just ignored the recommendations, and they were just working with just carried on as if the judicial review had never happened. And, and then, of course, they picked the wrong guy because he was able to raise it in the Scottish Parliament because he was an MSP. And then they were saying, we've been meaning to get round to having a look at this, I mean, who knows? We could both be on it as we're sitting having this conversation.
Absolutely.
But, again, remember, the public reads that and thinks, well, I don't like the idea that my grandkids, my wee granddaughters are in trying on dresses, and, some man comes in, because that's, he's exploiting that situation because there's uncertainty around about it, But if you say anything about it, you're going to get put on some kind of register. It's concerning because, again, the effect is most people will just say, well, I'm not sure what that is. Is it somebody who's exploiting the situation because he wants to get access to kids? And we know that there's a lot of people who are in that situation. We deal with them in court all the time, and we know, how devious they are in the way in which they find ways to get access to children. But now you're thinking, if I go and say to the woman who's in charge of the changing room, am I going to end up on a hate crime register for mentioning it, And when there's uncertainty like that, I suppose the majority of the population just say, I'm just going to shut up and stay at home and watch Netflix,
So if there is a desired effect for curtailing free speech, then I guess it's a subtle way to do it.
It's a very effective way to do it because you don't even need to go to court and argue about it. I mean, every now and again, somebody will take a stand and they'll be prosecuted and it'll end up in the appeal court or the Supreme Court. But most people aren't like that. Most people just say, my blooming life is complicated enough, just trying to get the money to pay the mortgage and the council tax. So the last thing I need is a £5,000 fine for saying something on Twitter,
Yeah, absolutely. So just another point of law we were just going to have a chat about was the recent, you mentioned the Supreme Court, but there was a recent decision on gender which was brought from Scotland, and that was so again, were you surprised by the decision there?
No, I mean, I wasn't surprised in the slightest. It's the only way really to make sense of the world, isn't it? That in 99% of situations, everybody's absolutely free to live how they want and dress how they want and all that. But, that there are certain parts of society in terms of changing rooms and prisons where the situation is complicated. So, there just needs to be clear lines, and there are pretty obvious clear lines in terms of biological sex. So there was no surprise, I've got to say, nor is there any surprise that the Scottish Government have largely ignored the legislation and seem to be continuing to do that,
I was going to ask you about that, Tommy, because it's weeks now since that decision was made, yet we see very little recognition of it here in Scotland. So
actually a kind of resistance to it, isn't it? And again, I was I chose to intervene where politicians were describing it as an English court. We're bound by, Scotland's bound by a decision of an English court. I mean, it's not an English court. In the 275 debate, two of the judges were Scottish. The chairman of the courts, Lord Reid, who's Scottish, and the court who did the Equality Act Supreme Court decision, it was a combination of English, Scottish, Welsh and Irish, I think, possibly, So again, instead of actually addressing what was discussed in the court, it's a kind of, well, they're not really a court, and we've been subjugated by England, and here's another example. It's kind of, it seemed to me it's likely that is a factor, that there's a resentment to the fact there is a Supreme Court in the first place. It's seen as a kind of English institution, and so resistance. And listen, it shouldn't be happening. The Scottish Government, the reason there is a Supreme Court is to hold government to account, essentially, isn't it? That's the point it exists, that, people have human rights which governments cannot withdraw. And when they try to withdraw them, you can go to the Supreme Court. They seem resistant to that idea because they're a bit authoritarian. They like the idea that the government can tell you exactly what you're allowed to do, and they resent the fact the Supreme Court can say, no, you can't do that. It's a breach of human rights, or you're interpreting the act the wrong way, or you're trying to bring in basically every time the Scottish Government have gone to the Supreme Court, they've taken a doing, frankly, in the devolution, in the Equality Act, so it's unsurprising that they're not that keen on it, but for them just to ignore the decision as they seem to have done, I guess it's a bit troubling. It is troubling because, they tried to remove juries, they tried to remove juries who, again, are a check on government excess, that if the government try and put you in prison for something serious, you've got 15 members of the public who can come in and say, no, we're not having that, Again, same with the Supreme Court. If they overstep the mark in terms of bringing in legislation, the Supreme Court can say, no, you can't do it. I don't think the Scottish Government like juries or the Supreme Court. So, and there's plenty of evidence from their statements in relation to it. So I'm not surprised that they've more or less ignored the effect of it. I'm not surprised at it.
I guess though they're going to come up against situations where it's going to become an issue and they're going to have to address it sooner or later. I can just if there are questions over, I don't know, maybe something about a male going into a female prison, something like that, then it's going to have to be addressed. And the Supreme Court have given their decisions. So it seems a rather foolish approach for them to ignore it rather than...
Well, 100% agree with you, especially when many political commentators think that the prisons issue really ended Nicola Sturgeon as First Minister. There was huge public concern at the idea that a man who has raped a woman can, between the rape and the trial, dress as a woman and end up as a convicted rapist in a female prison. Now, I know people take an extreme view on that one way or the other, but that just doesn't make any sense to most people. And, this is a continuation of it in a way, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's where the problems are going to arise. The guy who, the man who's working towards a sex change and is dressing as a woman is unlikely really to get rub up against the law in any way until he goes into a women's changing room or he appears in court for, these are the difficult issues. And generally it seems that the Scottish government's approach is to pretend they're not happening,
And difficult as well when you've got the approach that we spoke of earlier this morning in our other talk, where complainers are very much at the forefront, and predominantly females.
Yeah.
So I'm not quite sure how they reconcile where you've got a protected woman in a sexual offence case, but yet you've then got an accused who's saying that they've changed sex and wanting to be in a, it just all becomes terribly confused.
It's an incredibly difficult issue, and I saw, I heard Anne Widdecombe been kind of attacked. Not attacked, but she was been challenged, and the interviewer was saying, he was quite a kind of shock jock type, saying, under no circumstances should any person born male end up in a women's prison. Now, I don't agree with that. If somebody is, been living as a woman longer than he's been living as a man, and is to all extents has the appearance of a biological woman, it's going to be highly dangerous to put that person in a man's prison, So again, it is a very difficult issue. I don't know what the answer to it is.
In line with the Supreme Court decision, then they would have to.
Exactly.
Exactly. I mean, my personal view is it's black and white, and I appreciate that there are difficulties, and it's incredibly difficult for a lot of these people.
Aye.
in many ways. But again, there's got to be a line drawn somewhere, and I think that's probably where Anne.
You might, supposing you're right. I find that issue really, really difficult. But supposing you're right, and you put that person in a male prison, and the person is tortured or raped or assaulted or something, then obviously there's a concern then, because you're thinking you made the wrong decision. Probably that person would still be alive if it had gone to a female prison, But
I suppose you're going to have that situation with vulnerable men anyway,
absolutely.
So
but they're difficult. My point is really that there are difficult issues that are not going to be resolved by everybody ignoring them.
Yeah. And
the government, you identify that they've ignored it. I see where you're coming from. The wider problem is the public don't want to talk about them. I'm having this discussion with you, and you can pick it up. I don't know, in the mythical example, the Anne Widdecombe example, I'm trying to discuss it without using he or she, him or her. I'm deliberately doing that because, I don't want to offend anybody, I don't want to hurt anybody. But that is just a perfect example that we're just sitting here, we're not harming anybody. But even in that context, I'm really struggling to know what terminology to use, because I don't want to, be accused of being a transphobe or any of the epithets which are thrown about. And when you're in that situation, it's going to restrict public debate, which is really the theme of what we've been discussing.
I think
isn't it?
that kind of comes to the heart of it as well. People are nowadays so offended, whereas to sit down, have a chat, and we're not disagreeing strongly. You've got your view, I've got mine, and we can still sit and have a discussion about it. That's the way it should be. But it seems nowadays people take one extreme or the other and then become offended, and then they say, "Well, I can't debate with you because we can't. We don't see eye to eye."
I'll give you a good example, a real life example. At the time of the Isla Bryson case, there was a lot of debate about what prison he should go to, and somebody had raised the question of, can a woman be convicted of rape? So the idea was he can't be a woman because a woman can't be convicted of rape. Unwisely, as it turned out, I quoted word for word the appropriate section of the 2009 Sexual Offences Act, and I described what the crime of rape was, and I said that in the legislation, penis included an artificially constructed penis. And I said, so if you take the view that a woman can have an artificially constructed penis, then a woman can be convicted of rape. That's all I said. I just quoted it. And a legal trainee, incredibly, somebody who claimed to be a legal trainee, accused me of a lack of humanity on LinkedIn and said, couldn't believe that I had said this, accused me of a basic lack of humanity and I said, I just quoted, section 12 of the 2009 Act.
A bit like Murdo Fraser, just stating facts.
And, and a lot of people came to my defence and said, you've never met the guy, and I can be accused of a lot of things. I don't think many people would accuse me of that. No. To be honest, I try to get on with people as well as I can. And then my wife reads it and she said, "Were you getting involved in this for?" Why are you talking about the trans issue? You know that people are, how this debate goes. You know that you're going to go. Why you? And she never ever has ever criticised me for anything like that. But she reads all these things as well in the papers and everything. And she's thinking, well, if you get involved in that debate, people are. So why did you not just talk about something else?
But then again, that's another curtailment of freedom of speech. And I'm sure you, like I, don't enter a discussion to offend or upset anyone. But if you're in stating facts or speaking truth, it offends, then there's very little you can do about that. If your intention is not to deliberately cause upset, and like in that situation, you're simply pointing out what the law is. How do you ever win? Well,
you don't, and it's the same theme throughout this discussion we've been having, that one of my faculty colleagues came to my defence and get tore in here and said, "I've known this guy for 40 years, and how dare you say this," and all that, and which I found quite funny. But his response might equally be, right, I've said my piece. I'm now never going to say anything about the trans rights issue ever again, if this is the way it goes, so I'm just, and I wasn't really saying anything about the trans rights issue. I was saying interesting, and it is interesting to a legal geek like me that we're all talking about this as if this is the first time it's ever happened. But in fact, this legislation would have been debated in 2006, 2007, 2008. And back then they were talking about this, that, could somebody with a artificially constructed penis commit rape? And presumably it was debated back then. So my point was really, this is no new, this is something that's actually been in the legislation since 2009, but even restricting, it was only one person, it's not that it was, but the fact you said, it appears that it's a subject that people get themselves really, really upset about. And I suppose I'm just saying that's the perfect example of it, where it never occurred to me, occasionally I'll write something and I think, well, I know I'm going to get some kickback on this because I've had it before when I've talked about this. Never occurred to me for a second that you could get personal criticism for quoting a section of the Act, but I got it. And again, some lawyers will read it and just say, he's off his head. Why is he spending his Saturday mornings writing about this, when he could be away playing golf or, No,
but I think, Tommy, you are the one person certainly visible on social media who's prepared to put your head above the parapet, and not in a antagonistic way. You're just informing, as you say, you inform the public. You break it down in a way that's easy to understand. And it's a shame, it's sad that we're at a point in society where, if you're saying something somebody doesn't agree with, then you're automatically thought that you're considered to hate them or hate their ideas. That's so not the situation. It shouldn't be. Humans are designed to interact with each other and be able to have a sensible debate. But thank you for having a sensible debate with me today. Thank you so much for your time, Tommy.
No bother. Thank you.